So this is the reverb of Bitwig Studio, and it's dissected into three main parts. We have the early reflections part here, where we can kind of simulate some room, some individual room, some imaginary room. It's not a real room simulation. It's just to, you know, give you the feel of some kind of room. Then we have the late reflections part here in the middle, where you can try and ring out the sound you just produced here with the early reflections. And then we have the output part here, where you can mix in the wet signal slowly to the dry signal. If you have this at 0%, you have the dry signal only. If you pull this up to 100%, we only hear the wet signal. And you probably want something in the middle here, where you have a mixture of the reverb and the dry signal. Then we have the width knob here. And with this one, you can make the output completely mono by pulling this down to 0%. 100% is basically no change to the stereo signal at all. And 150% is increasing the side channels of a signal. And I think you also reduce a bit the mid channel of a signal. So you make the stereo signal even wider. So if you double click this, you go back to a specific of 80.6% for whatever reason. I have no idea why, but that's the default for me. And then we have a wet FX box, where you can add audio effects to the wet signal only. And we have a tank FX box here, where you can put on some audio effects to the feedback chain, because every reverb has some kind of feedback routing. And this means that internally you take the output of the reverb and feed it back into the input of the reverb. So you create this kind of looping behavior inside the reverb, and the more you add feedback to it, or the more you add gain to this routing, you can sustain the reverb even longer. And every time you iterate through this routing, you add here some kind of audio effect to it. So this has a big influence on the texture of the sound of the reverb. So you can drastically change how the reverb sounds with this tank FX box. And this is also where you can get creative. So maybe we completely focus on the early reflections part here. And to do this, we bring down here the late mix to 0%. So we only hear this part here. And then we have an input signal of a piano sound. It sounds like this. And then we pull up the mixer to 100%, so we can only hear what the reverb is doing, or what the reverb does. And this is basically just the early reflections part here. And with early reflections, the meaning of that is that basically when you are inside of a room and you have inside this room some kind of sound source, maybe a speaker, maybe you just sitting there talking, these sound waves are going out to the room over the air to a wall. And then these walls, of course, depends on their material, are reflecting these sound waves. And the first reflection from these walls are going back to your ears or to your microphone or whatever you have inside this room. So this is basically what we are talking about early reflections. It's the first sound wave hitting the walls of your imaginary room, coming back to you into your ears. And yeah, you can change here how the room is looking, or what kind of imaginary room you want to have. So room model is probably just a smaller room, hall is something bigger, and then you can change the size here by increasing the percentage value of this room. So maybe we just go here with the room. So this simulates some kind of smaller room. And indeed, it sounds like a small room. What you can't change is basically where you are in this room. So at which position, or where the sound source is. So sometimes you want to move closer to your sound source with the microphone. So imagine you have an empty room. Inside this room is a piano. This one, right? And you want to move with the microphone closer to your piano. And you can't do this here. But what you can do is you just bring down the mix knob. And this gives you more of the direct signal from the piano itself. So the piano sends out sound waves, but instead of what is reflected from the walls, you want to hear more of the direct sound coming directly from the piano without the reflections. So you can do this with the mix knob, right? So this is completely direct signal. And then you move away from the piano with your microphone. And the more you move away from this piano, you get more and more information from your room instead of your piano, because the piano moves farther away, and you get more and more room information. So this is what you can simulate basically with this mix knob, how close you are to your source. And also we can use this to imagine inside of a mixdown, because reverbs are used also as a mixing tool, because you can bring sounds or sound sources more in the background or more in the foreground, right? So you can say, I want to have this piano sound slightly in the background. So instead of just pulling down the volume on the piano, you can also use reverb and put it in the background. So it's more like a 3D kind of moving your instruments away. And instruments more in the foreground, like a lead sound, you want to have probably a lot less reverb or room information on there. So we pull this back here to 100%, and you can change here, of course, the room size. We can make this room a bit bigger, so we can increase here the size to 200%. Or make it even smaller. And you can hear from these artifacts coming in when I change the value that we change indeed some delay times. So there are probably some kind of all-pass devices involved in this kind of simulation here, and where you change basically the delay times of these all-pass devices. Okay, so then we have down here diffusion, and this is pretty important to know that we actually change here all pass parameters, because with diffusion we can change how evenly distributed these delay times are, which means you have probably maybe 4, 5 or 10 or whatever individual all pass delays, and each all pass device has a different delay time. And you can spread out these delay times here more evenly with the diffusion. And you can hear when we have this down here at 0%, we can hear these individual delay tabs. You can hear these small little delay things, right? And if you pull this up, we have a more like a smoother signal. So you can use this maybe if you want to simulate some kind of stadium or some big live concert where you have more like a bigger space, but still you have reflecting walls from different houses or skyscrapers or maybe ad signs or something like this. You can pull this down here and then you have this kind of effect. And you simulate more like a dense room where you have a lot of stuff in there. The diffusion is not so clear, so or more clearer or more diffuse. Then you pull this up to 100% and it's much, much smoother. Okay, so and this has a big influence on the sound itself, how you model your room basically. So it's a room simulation, what you have here, a small, little, simple room simulation. And if you switch to hall, you have probably a much, much bigger room. And 200% is even more bigger. And when you pull diffusion down, you can hear more delay tabs because the room is bigger. Actually, you probably don't change your delay times. You bring in, it sounds more like that you bring in more RPass devices or something like this. Here you have maybe just 3 RPass devices playing or 4. And here you have maybe 10. So you have more in between. I don't know how this is made internally. I have no idea, but I'm guessing. I'm guessing how this works basically, just to give you a rough explanation. So now that we can model our room, our first reflection room, or the first reflections of this imaginary room, we can then go into the next stage here, which is the late stage. And the late stage simulates basically how long it takes to ring out for a signal. So you maybe imagine you have like this room, and then you stretch out this room so it's longer and has more depth, like it's more like a tunnel, right? So you can increase your delay time. You can bring in the late mix here. And the delay time here goes up to 31.6 seconds. It's also a very specific number for some reason. And then you have both these knobs here, left and right, this blue one and this red one. And you can change the delay times relative to this main delay time here for the lower part. At this basically a frequency splitter in here, or you have two reverbs or 2 late stages. One is the lower late stage here, and one is the higher late stage, and higher means higher frequencies and lower frequencies. So if you want to have more like a deeper sounding reverb, you can increase the delay time for this low stage here by using this, and you can see it's times 1.78 times the mid timing. So it's 1.78 times longer than 31.6 seconds. And maybe you also want to have a shorter upper delay time, so we can pull this down here, nearly half timing of this one, half as long as this number. So you can also influence how this reverb is weighted in frequency and the frequency distribution. And you have a mix knob. So this is the late mix only, I think. Or not only, it's actually, it goes into the early reflections and then into the late mix, but you only have here the late mix happening. So it's basically a serial routing. If you pull this down to 50%, you can hear the late mix and the early reflections mix on top. So it's parallel and serial at the same time. And then you have this build-up knob here. And this works, in my opinion, exactly the same as the diffusion. It can make delay smoother. Here you can still hear some delay taps happening over time. Right? Maybe make this a bit, this room smaller. Make it even super small. I can hear these small little delay taps. And you can, remove this by using build up. So we bring this up and it's much smoother. You can't make out these delay taps anymore. Maybe a bit shorter. And here you can hear it clearly. So what this means is you can easily switch this reverb between having here completely nice little delay taps. So we pull this diffusion down, make this bit bigger here so we can hear these delay tabs from the earlier reflections part. And we can use here this one and use the build up at 0%. So we have only individual delay tabs, which makes it sometimes sound like even a grain reverb. Or we can make it super smooth by pulling this up. So this is basically how the reverb works and how you can utilize this. It's super simple, super easy, and you can tweak it a lot. I forgot to mention that you can change here the frequency splitter if you want to. But I never did this really, but you can try it out. You can change the sound, of course, with this too, when you change the delay times for certain bands, and try and figure out what kind of sound you're going for. Maybe make the lower part a bit longer. Also depends on what kind of sound you are using as a source. Okay, so now that we have this, we close this down, and maybe we increase here the sizing of Bitwig so we can see what's going on. So maybe you want to use the Tank FX at first with the pitch device, which is the easiest and nicest way to explain this. So the Tank FX, in my opinion, goes only onto the late stage. It's also building up here at the moment. Because this is yellow and also the Tank FX is yellow. So in my opinion, Tank FX only works on the late stage. And so we bring up here the late stage and say we want to go every time we go through the feedback loop. I think here also the late reverb time is basically a gain knob. You increase the gain of the feedback routing. So if you pull this up, you increase the loudness of the feedback routing. So every time we pass through this pitch shifter here, we increase the pitch by, let's say, 12 semitones, or maybe go 2 or maybe 5 semitones, and bring the mix up. And this should end up in some kind of, yeah, slow increase of notes. You can hear every time it goes through this loop, you add 5 semitones to this audio signal. So it goes da, 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 up every time we pass through this feedback loop. And we can utilize this and say we want to maybe go in unison steps here in 12 semitones and make some kind of shimmer reverb. If you think this is too drastic, then you can try it on the wet FX. So the wet FX is basically just the output, the wet signal of the reverb. So there's no feedback happening, so you only pitch up by 12 semitones. Maybe bring in the mix here. So that's something you can do. Also interesting is on the Tank FX here, maybe use a rotary. A rotary device is basically changing here the loudness with an LFO and also the timing, delay modulation here with the rate. So you can use a slow rate and change the timing a bit and the amplitude a bit. So you bring in some movement to the reverb over time. Or maybe try it out even here on the wet FX. So rotary is very nice on the Tank FX in my opinion. Also, you can use a chorus. Maybe use one of the new chorus devices here. And yeah, make it even wider. I bring the feedback down. So you can use all kinds of devices just to experiment with the reverb and what does what to the sound. And certain combinations can give you a really nice reverb just by yeah, experimenting with the Tank FX and the Wet FX box. But this video is only about the reverb and how it works. So I want to end this video here, and you probably find at some point on my main channel a lot of tips and tricks how you can use or utilize the reverb with certain different devices.